What's going on, everybody? It's Charles. In this video, we are going to be installing a new downpipe on the Golf R. All right, as we continue our quest for full stage 2 on the Golf R, the downpipe installation is up next. If you are planning on going full stage 2, that typically includes things like an upgraded downpipe, which is what we're installing today, an upgraded charge cooler, an upgraded turbo inlet pipe, and of course software. Out of all the things that we're going to install on the Golf R for the stage 2 project, the downpipe's probably the one that's going to be the trickiest. Now, having removed it, I can tell you that if I had to do it again, I'd probably take the entire prop shaft out. You'll see what we're going to do to kind of get around taking the entire prop shaft out. But I really think after a bit of struggle, a bit of fighting, it's just going to be easier to go ahead and take the prop shaft out. It's 5 more bolts than I took out and a lot less headache and hassle. I'll also say for this job, you got to get the car high up in the air. If you're working on jack stands, like on the lowest setting, you're never going to get this downpipe out. This is a place where if you got a buddy with a lift, or you can get the car up off the ground around 2 feet, you're gonna be good to go. This is a really long factory pipe, and so you have to really maneuver it, wiggle it, turn it, twist it, hold your mouth right, hold your face right in order to get it out anyway. And then when you're working low to the ground, you'll find that the end will actually hit the ground quite a bit. Now there is a place on this pipe if you wanted to go ahead and cut it. I'm actually okay with that. There's a really good section right here that you can cut it on. Just make sure you cut it in a way where you can put another clamp on it if you ever have to go back to factory. Our upgraded one is just this short pipe here, but there is a whole nother long section because they do end up having to be the same length. The downpipe we're installing today is from Integrated Engineering. These are great dudes, good friends of mine, great friends of the show, so I'm excited to run this downpipe. All right, so here is our new downpipe setup. We have our new downpipe with the catalytic converter. We have our extension pipe, a handful of clamps. The V-band bro clamp goes between the cat section and the extension pipe. We have our bracket here that will attach to where our rubber grommet is on the subframe. You'll also notice we have a series of new bolts. Don't be stubborn like me. Go ahead and take the prop shaft out. It will make your life easier. If you do that though, you are going to need to replace these 12-point bolts right here, 3 in the front, 3 in the back of the prop shaft. We also have the bolts for the dog bone mount that are one-time use only, and I actually got a couple of extra ones that you probably don't need, but I have them just in case, but it looks like you're just gonna need these bolts here. There are 2 tools that you're gonna need that you may not have, so this is worth noting. One is going to be a wrench for the oxygen sensor. You're gonna have to take the downstream oxygen sensor out, so you're gonna need a wrench to do that. You could probably sneak a 22mm wrench up there, but having a socket like this makes it much easier. It's got a channel cut in it so that you don't have to worry about damaging the wires. Also, you are going to need a 10mm 12-point socket. And while that in of itself is not a super specialty thing, I actually had to dig to find my 12-point socket because most of my stuff is 6-point, but you will need a 12-point for those bolts for the prop shaft. Also, not a bad idea to have either a universal joint or a wibble wobble socket to make it easier to get on those bolts. And I did find that there's a couple places where a long extension is going to be very, very handy. Not mandatory, but it will make your life quite a bit easier. One word of caution, if you have just Johnny race car'd your car or taken it on a long drive, these components that we're going to be working with are going to be hot, so be extra careful here. You may want to put some heat-resistant gloves on or just let it cool down a little bit. On most of the exhaust work that I like to do, I actually like to spray some penetrating oil on the fasteners before I take them off. Even if you don't have a bunch of rust buildup on your car, like my car, which is pretty much brand new, it's nice to lubricate those bolts a little bit because it typically makes them come out a little bit easier. Next, let's go ahead and take our clamp loose. This is a 6mm Allen that you're gonna need to loosen it. Now this one came loose super duper duper easy. If your car has a bunch of miles on it, it may not come loose that easy. You may have to take a screwdriver or a pry bar and right between the 2 clamp pieces and pop it loose. Technically, you're supposed to replace this clamp after you take it loose. We're gonna go ahead and try and reuse it since it's so new. Next, we're gonna need to get the downstream oxygen sensor out. For this, you are going to need an oxygen sensor wrench. Once you have the oxygen sensor loose, we can go ahead and take the wire loom out so we don't twist up our wires, and then remove the oxygen sensor the rest of the way. Next up, we need to get this belly pan off. As you can see, I have the all-track belly pan, which has a handful more hardware than the stock belly pan. If you have the stock belly pan, just go ahead and take that off too. Either way, we want it out of our way. Next up, we're gonna take the heat shield off that covers the axle on the passenger side front. This has two fasteners on it that you're gonna need an 8mm Allen for. And really the best way I've found to access them is by grabbing a long extension and going through the wheel well right along where the front axle is and getting to them that way. Now, once we have that cover down, if we look really close, we can see the bolt that holds the heat shield on that covers the prop shaft. We're gonna need to get that off next. Now, the best way I've found to access that bolt that holds that heat shield on is with a deep well 16mm socket, a universal joint, and a couple long extensions so that you can get on it through the fender well. Next, we're going to remove the other bolt that holds on the heat shield over the prop shaft. This is going to be a number 10 triple square, and the best way I found to get to this, that's a long extension, a universal, and a triple square. Once you have the bolts out, you got to kind of rotate and wiggle this heat shield to get it out. Be careful though, you don't want to bend it, and we don't really want to scratch up any of our stuff underneath our car. Now, because we're going to take the prop shaft out, we need to mark it to make sure that it goes back in the same orientation that it did when it came out. So we're going to just do our normal marking here. It doesn't have to be anything crazy. So now we know when we go back together with it, we're going to line up this bolt with that purple mark right there. Next up, it's time to go ahead and take the prop shaft loose. This is where you're going to need your 10mm 12-point socket in order to get those 3 bolts out. Now, I hit the jackpot on these bolts. It's going to be really easy. I can get them, all 3 of them out without rotating the prop shaft at all. If you didn't get so lucky, you are going to need to rotate the prop shaft. And in order to do that, you need to take the parking brake off and put the car in neutral so that you can turn it by hand. Like for a lot of other fasteners on this job, a universal is probably going to work really, really well for here. This is actually a 12-point 10mm universal, and we're just going to get right on each of those bolts and loosen them up. This long extension with the universal or the wobble on it seems to be the hero tool for this job so far. Our next step is going to be removing the 2 bolts that hold the dog bone mount in. These are 18mm headed bolts, and these are also technically one-time use, so if we take them out, we're going to want to replace them. I'd like to take the bolts for the prop shaft out first, then do the dog bone so the whole engine cradle is not moving around while you're trying to loosen the bolts. These are 2 different length bolts. The shorter one is the one that goes in the front. The longer one then, of course, goes to the back. Next up, we are going to rock the entire engine assembly forward to pull the prop shaft out of the bevel box and slide it over to the driver's side. Couple of things to take into note. We want to be careful where we pry. We want to make sure that we're prying like here on the transmission. So we'll take our pry bar, we'll go between the transmission and the subframe. We will pry the engine as far forward as we can. Then we're going to take a block of wood between the bevel box and the subframe and put it up there to hold the transmission in place. You probably need to disconnect this connector right here before doing that because we don't want to crush anything over here. Now what we can do is we can go through the transmission tunnel and move the prop shaft over to the driver's side. Also, be very, very careful with the prop shaft. There is a pilot bearing inside the center of the prop shaft. We don't want to wobble that bearing out or mess it up or anything. We want to keep it nice and straight, so you need to pull the prop shaft all the way off the bevel box, then slide it over to the side. All right, next we need to get these 2 13mm nuts off of our stock cat or downpipe, whatever you want to call it. These are mounted to the bracket which bolts to the engine and is kind of one of the main holders of the catalytic converter. These 2 13mm nuts should be pretty easy to get to from either the top or the bottom, whichever way makes you happier. As you can see, they're just in front of where we took that oxygen sensor out. We are dangerously close to having this downpipe out. Next, we're going to take these 2 13mm bolts out right here. Then we're going to go all the way back to the back and take this clamp off. Now, once you start relieving pressure off this clamp, you need to be extra careful. Your exhaust could swing down, so you may actually want to put something up here to support it if you can. Okay, next up, we remove our factory downpipe. We'll start by moving the clamp off the back, lowering that down. Make sure we're off the turbo, and then very gently, very carefully, move the pipe on out. There we go. Victory! Yay! We did it! Now, a couple of questions that I've seen come up about downpipes. Charles, can I install this without the Stage 2 software? Yes, you can. You, however, will not get the maximum benefit out of this high flow pipe that you would if you do software. Next up, will this cause a check engine light if I don't do the software upgrade? Well, it's very possible that it may. Even though this does have a catalytic converter in it, it is going to probably be a higher flow cat than our factory one, so you may run into that. I also think that if you're planning on doing this downpipe, they're not cheap. Do the software too. That's really what's meant to happen. Just like with the charge cooler, having the downpipe and the software, they all work together. Now, this is also probably going to be a good time if you want to upgrade your exhaust. Go ahead and do it. You're going to have part of it off anyway. For me, I'm sticking with just the downpipe for now. I want to hear how it sounds. I'll give you guys an audio clip when we're done. I want to hear how it sounds. I like that the R is quiet. All right, let's go ahead and weigh these two pipes and see if there's much difference between the factory one and the aftermarket one. So our factory one weighs about 19 pounds. Not too bad. So our small section weighs about 13 pounds, and our tall section weighs in a little over 7 pounds. So they actually weigh right about the same. Also, not a bad idea if your car has a pretty good amount of miles on it to replace this clamp from the turbo to the downpipe, as well as consider the seal around the turbocharger. My car's pretty low mileage, so I'm not going to do that. But if I had anywhere over like 50,000 miles, I would definitely replace both of these. All right, next up, it is time to install our new freshy fresh downpipe. Hopefully this one goes in a little easier than the stock one came out, or hopefully you're not being super stubborn like me and you actually take the prop shaft out to make your life easier. All right, well, she's set on there. We'll go ahead and set it there and get everything else done, but that was 800,000 times easier. All right, next we want to get this new section of pipe loosely started. So what we're going to do is we're going to just put on the 13 millimeter nuts that go to the bracket that's attached to the engine. We're going to just loosely put on the clamp that goes from the new downpipe to the turbocharger. We're not going to tighten it down till we have everything in place and we can tighten down the whole exhaust in case we need to move or shift or rotate anything. This way we don't end up tightening one spot, causing a bind in another. Once you have the exhaust started, we can go ahead and put our prop shaft back into place. We need to make sure that we line up our purple marks so that we get it clocked correctly, which shouldn't be a big deal if you didn't take it out, but if you did take it out, definitely make sure you get it clocked correctly. Also, we need to be extremely careful putting the prop shaft back into place. We don't want to damage that bushing right there, so it needs to go in nice and evenly. If you get it in at a weird angle or anything like that, you run the risk of damaging that bearing. I don't know if that bearing is available separately, but I sure don't want to have to find out. So in order to make 100% sure we have our alignment for our bevel box to the prop shaft right, we're going to go ahead and put our dog bone mount bolts in. Remember, these are technically one-time use bolts, so you should be using new ones. Now, we go to try and put them in, we notice they won't go in because our alignment for our dog bone and our powertrain is out of whack. So we'll actually need to take the engine cradle, move it back to line it up. You can try and do this by hand if you want. You may need a pry bar to give you a little bit of assistance. I almost always start these by hand. I like to start both of them and then just kind of wiggle the engine back and forth and make sure that it doesn't need to settle. As you can see, we have our witness marks where our old bolts were. We can use that to line them up. You don't want to tighten these up while they're under pressure though. We need to make sure that alignment is correct. Once you have these lined up, we're going to torque these to 50 Newton meters. After torquing those dog bone bolts down, that should have put our alignment for our prop shaft pretty much perfect where it needs to be. I'm gonna go ahead and tighten these by hand. Then we're gonna torque all 3 to 50 Newton meters and then an additional 90 degrees. If you're having problems seeing some of those bolts, if you go underneath the subframe and look between the power steering rack and this hole in the subframe here, you can actually see our prop shaft bolts really, really well. We also want to make sure that we plug our connector right next to the prop shaft back in. All right, next up, we need to go ahead and get our heat shields on for our prop shaft and for our passenger side axle. Both of these two components do take a little bit of finagling in order to get installed properly, so you may have to kind of twist and rotate and turn them in order to get them properly set. You need to start with the one over the prop shaft first. This one has 2 bolts. It has that 16mm headed bolt with the little stud on the end of it, and then it has a triple square. I like to start them both by hand so that we make sure our shield is properly aligned. The triple square gets torqued to 20 Newton meters, and the 16mm head bolt gets torqued to 40 Newton meters. Now, it's gonna be kind of tricky to get a torque wrench in there all the way straight, even, and narrow. Really, you just gotta do your best here to get them properly tightened. Next, let's do that shield over the passenger side axle. This one's kind of the same way. You gotta sort of twist it and turn it. Find it's easy to come in through the fender well and get it properly aligned. Get your little caps started. These are the 8mm caps. Get those started. Again, start them both, snug them both down by hand, and then torque those to 25 Newton meters. Okay, next step is going to be installing our straight pipe. We need to get all of our clamps and everything ready to go before we slide under the car. Now, we are installing this on the factory exhaust. If you're installing it on a different size exhaust, this adapter piece you need might be different. Just like with our front piece, we're gonna install everything loose and then we'll snug it down. Let's go ahead and fine tune how we have everything installed. Here is our dual clamp. I'm installing it so that the orientation of the bolts and nuts will never have an opportunity to hit the prop shaft. The nuts are gonna be facing down and I'll end up angling them slightly. Next, we'll put our reducer piece on. Since we don't know exactly how far this is gonna need to go on, we're just gonna kind of get it on for now. We'll go ahead and get our big pipe in next. Slide your clamp loosely into place, and I'm gonna orient these pretty much the same way so that no matter how much the exhaust moves, we don't have to worry about hitting the prop shaft. Next, we are going to set our front section. This is where we're gonna take our V-band clamp. We may have to play around with the orientation of this as well. For now, I'm gonna put it with the screw onto the driver's side. Now, we may also need to rotate our exhaust pipe around to make sure that our clearance is good. We don't want to have it risking hitting any heat shield. We also want to make sure our exhaust is not under any stress or anything at this point either. We can fine tune it later. For right now, let's just get the V-band started. All right, it's loose, we can still move it around, but now that it's at least on there, we can start to twist, turn, and make sure the rest of our exhaust is lined up. Next, let's go ahead and get our bracket that attaches to the subframe installed. Now, there's really not much movement on this, but I'm gonna leave it a little loose anyway, just in case we need to shift it around. Next, we'll take our bracket and we'll go ahead and pop it on in. Typically, the bracket goes in front of the downpipe. Next, we'll get our bolt, put it through the bracket and the downpipe. Should go bolt, washer, downpipe, bracket, washer, and nut. Now we're going to leave this loose as well. We're going to go up top and start tightening the exhaust and working our way back. Something I want to do before we start tightening everything back up is loosen this bolt right here. I think if we were replacing like the factory catalytic converter, I probably wouldn't loosen this, but because our aftermarket one is probably going to have a little bit different dimension, I'm going to loosen it just a little bit, enough so that we can wiggle the whole exhaust and get it installed. Now it's time to go ahead and start tightening everything down. There is an order for this downpipe that you need to tighten things down in. First, we need to do the nut on the bracket on the driver's side. This is going to be closest to the prop shaft. We need to tighten that one to 20 Newton meters. Next, we need to do the clamp that goes from the downpipe to the turbocharger. That gets torqued to 15 Newton meters. Third, we're gonna do the other nut on the bracket closer to the passenger side. That's gonna be torqued to 20 Newton meters. And then 4, we're gonna tighten down the nut just in front of the one we just did. 20 Newton meters on that one as well. It's gonna be tricky getting a torque wrench in there, so just do your best on that one. Once that's done, we can then move our way back to the rest of the exhaust, twist it, turn it, move it around, make sure our clamps are oriented properly, make sure we don't have any clearance issues, and really give the exhaust a good shake and make sure that if you romp on the throttle and the whole powertrain moves back and forth, or you hit a bump or something like that, it's not gonna hit the heat shield. More importantly, you're not gonna hit the prop shaft. Once the exhaust is in, go ahead and install that O2 sensor. I'm cool if you want to put a tiny bit of anti-seize on the threads. It's not 100% needed, but I'm cool if you do it. Just make sure you don't get any on the sensor itself. Go ahead and reroute that O2 harness and plug it back in. Then we're going to recheck our exhaust. Make sure everything's good, everything's tight. Double check and make sure that your exhaust hangers are hanging straight down. This will be a good indicator of whether or not you have your exhaust in a bind. It's also not a bad idea after, 100 miles or so, go back and double check all your fasteners and make sure that they're still tight. Once that's done, nothing left to do but get the car off the rack and take it on a drive. All right, so the downpipe is in. We are all set, ready to go. A couple minor tweaks to make sure it didn't hit anything, and now it's absolutely perfect. Now, after first startup, I noticed the car is a bit louder. Let's also note that it is in comfort mode right now. Let's see what happens when we turn it to race mode. So our exhaust flap did open, touch louder, barely could hear a difference. So let's go ahead and drive it. We'll go nice and slow while she warms up. I can already tell you the DSG pops, if that's your thing, are definitely going to be louder. Now, whether you use the rust penetrant or not, you're probably going to get kind of a weird smell at first. That's going to be any oil or grease or dirt or grime that got on that exhaust pipe while you were installing it or while it was being made or while it was being shipped. Super, super duper common. Race mode. We'll throw it manual, see if we can get some real fresh DSG pops. So if you like DSG pops, you might like this. Definitely a noticeable difference in DSG pops for sure. Now, without having done the software, I'm really not noticing the car driving any different. Yes, it's louder, so that's going to give us a little bit of a placebo, a little bit of a maybe butt dyno type improvement, but I don't feel like the car is any faster. I don't really notice any improvement in throttle response. I only notice that the car is louder. So we're well on our way to a full stage 2 build. If you guys want to check out the progress of the rest of the build of the car, I'll be sure to link the whole playlist and the individual stage 2 videos down in the description. As always, questions or comments, drop them down below. If you like the video, hit that thumbs up button. Don't forget to subscribe. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again next time. That was fun.